Welcome to Leading with Artivism. Leading with Artivism is a live monthly interview series created and curated by Poet Gold in collaboration with Arts Mid-Hudson, featuring a diverse mix of artivists, artist activists who have taken up the charge through their art to highlight social issues. We invite you to ask questions and get an inside look at the hearts and minds of these courageous creatives.
Mic is muted.
Yeah, now I can hear.
Welcome everyone to Leading with Artivism. I'm your host, Poet Gold, and we are here today with Onaje Benjamin. Onaje is a community activist and consultant with over 30 years of experience. He has expertise in community organizing, advocacy, criminal justice training, and staff development. Onaje facilitates workshops, lectures extensively, and has published articles on a variety of issues specific to human rights and social justice. He is a photographer, he is a community activist, and I am so glad that you're here to have a conversation with me today. Welcome.
Thank you, Gold.
There is so much to unpack in this about 30 to 40 minutes conversation, but let me start here with you because I came across something. But first I want to talk about how we first met. I believe we may have met at an exhibit at the Cooning Hackett Theater in Poughkeepsie, and then we met in other social settings, and we also participated together in the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, Undoing Racism, a workshop sponsored by Dutchess County Commission on Human Rights in collaboration with Poughkeepsie Healthy Black and Latinx Coalition. But I came across a quote that just gave me pause, and I wanted to make sure that it was you. It stated, "Poverty is a social construct of genocide, eliminating the lower class." Is there a relationship with your artistic work and this perspective?
I think so. And the quote, you probably did some research. It was probably from back in the 90s. But what I mean by being a social construct is that we're all born neither poor nor rich. We're born into spaces, and the politics of those spaces dictate what goes on. And many people associate poverty with violence, for example, though I think poverty is one of the most violent acts that a government or state can put upon a people. So it does impact my all the work I do, because I don't look at people. I see them as being impoverished, for example. So I know that helps to answer your question.
No, it answered it. Thank you. And I know you founded the Ujamaa Studio, and published your work. Can you share with the audience the significance of choosing the word Ujamaa to name your studio, and what led you to create space for your artistic medium of photography?
Well, many people might be familiar with Ujamaa as one of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, but the term was actually coined by Julius Nyerere in his battles against colonialism in Tanzania, and it's really about social and economic justice. It's a cooperative or collective way of approaching economics. Rather than having the have-nots, and the little want-mores, the focus is on equity.
So when you creating having the name for your studio speaks to where you are in your stance on how you approach your work.
Yes, yeah. I also, besides the photography, which is one aspect of my creative work, I'm also an archival custom picture framer. And I was blessed to get one of the Creators Build New York initiative grants. So my way of giving back is working with a lot of the area artists, particularly photographers, to help them to have low cost framing for their work.
Okay.
Many artists have to choose between ready-mades and things they find at flea markets to try to get their work on the wall. And that's one of my ways of sharing. That's my collectivism.
Right. Ergo cooperative economics. Let's take a look at your work, and discussed in the context of your life story that I've become somewhat familiar with. And I have a few questions for you. Okay, so can we begin the slides? So let's talk about this piece.
Yes, I first noticed this because my mother-in-law, who's since transitioned, was in a Lutheran care facility out on 4455. And from the porch of that facility, you could see Frank Brothers Farm.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's gone. And some people have told me that work in farming that it was some of the richest farmland, in the county. And that was wiped out and replaced with the next photo.
When you say it was wiped out, it was just removed, or
it was taken down. It was knocked down in order to put up a development, Eastdale.
Oh wow, okay.
Housing. And while we need housing, the second picture I call it Stepford Homes, kind of a play on the movie Stepford Wives.
Mm-hmm.
And this is no reflection on people who live there or the developers, but it's not the kind of housing that's balanced. I don't know how many of those units are dedicated to people who have less money than others.
Mm-hmm.
Again, even the term low income bothers me a little bit because something or some entity lowered the possibility of people to have a higher income. So people don't ask for the low income; they're forced into different tracks. And also, a lot of these communities, I feel they look a little different here than maybe in some other places, but they're almost gated. They're designed to have small stores and things like that, which is good for the people who live there.
Right, access.
But it doesn't necessarily allow for people to move into the community, to come into the city of Poughkeepsie to support the area businesses.
Okay, right. These sort of like these enclosures,
yes,
that are built with everything, so you don't have to leave,
right,
per se. You don't have to commune per se with your neighbor outside of that. I find sometimes communities like that sort of create an otherism.
Definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
But I love this photo because it's there's something very ominous and
foreboding.
Yes, foreboding about it. There really is. But you mentioned imbalance, and you talked about that a little bit. Can you talk about that a little bit more? From is it an economic imbalance? Is it a spiritual imbalance? Because I sort of can pick up in this photo a type of spiritual imbalance that's embedded in this.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was taken, I think, a couple of winters ago.
Okay.
And it was sometime in the late afternoon, and there's no one out.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. I didn't see one person. It looked like a ghost town.
Right.
Right. But the other part of the imbalance is as they develop these housing complexes, it doesn't speak to the housing needs of the locals.
Gotcha.
The rents are extremely high, and it's a much more complex issue than we have time to talk about tonight. But, I have been in a couple of meetings recently where they've been taking a look at the issue of trying to deal with the so-called unhoused. And again, all those terms to me have a directional almost toward the person as opposed to the system. People become unhoused.
Right.
I'm trying to see, George Carlin said that it wasn't a question of homelessness, it was houselessness. And his remedy was get rid of cemeteries and golf courses. Anyway.
Miss George Carlin, and that's exactly the point that I was making, because that speaks to the human spirit.
Yes.
It speaks directly to the spirit of mankind, the spirit of a community, the spirit of individuals. And I think a lot of times when things go awry, it's because the human spirit is broken.
Yeah, and I think when groups of people, by economic or otherwise, are self-isolate that way, they're robbed of a rich spiritual connection with interacting with other diverse populations.
Right. Do you have another photo?
Yeah, this I took across the street. Well, it's Poughkeepsie Savings Bank, but my wife Shirley and I last summer were in a solo show in Kingston at the Good Works Institute. But I found this piece interesting because it points to the erasure and gentrification. The piece is called Gentrification.
Okay.
Once there was a bank there, and this bank probably folded before 2008, but that's gone. Now there's something called Hoffa, which I may be wrong about this, but I don't think so. It's probably one of those predatory trade schools that wind up in low income communities and tend to charge 2 or 3 times what you would to get the same training at a community college.
Okay.
And then I have some shots of it, just the bank itself. And I think the American flags, are interesting symbols. But then I waited around a while, and this is who would come by, and a young man came by on a bike, and I'm assuming, could be wrong, that he has 3 30-gallon bags of probably recyclable cans he's taking someplace to cash in to try to survive. So I thought the layers of a corporate bank, a predatory training facility, and a homeless person kind of spoke to gentrification.
Absolutely. Is this for those people who may not be from Poughkeepsie? Is this located is this the bank on Market Street?
This is Market Street. It's a couple doors down from the Barnavon.
Right across from the county building, correct?
Yes, right across the motor vehicles.
Okay, all right, wonderful. Do you like taking black and whites?
Yes, almost exclusively, yeah.
Okay, and why is that?
Well,
versus color.
Versus color. Ansel Adams actually said something to the effect of color is distracting. It's very gorgeous and beautiful, but I like to work in black and white because of the contrast and the shades and the highlights. It's a much more powerful visual, and it's also technically abstract because we see in color. Our natural vision is color, so this shifts the brain immediately. And it tended to be the trade form of photography until color in the late 60s, early 70s.
Right.
So I just like the way it looks. I like working with it. I like playing with the different contrasts. If you look at this picture, the different shadings of the stones in the bank. I just think it's a much more effective, powerful look. And it's a bias. It's a style.
Got you. What moved you into photography, Onaje? Were you always a photographer? I mean, what brought you to this particular artistic discipline in order to express yourself?
Well, probably close to 40 years ago, I started shooting photography. Back when there was film was a major format. I lived in South Jersey at the time. I'm originally from New York, but lived in Jersey a good deal of time. And I just started moving around the community, shooting different things. I was focused on, I did what some people call projects. I shot street store churches, for example.
Okay.
I did a lot of work with getting to know the people in the community and doing street portraitures of people that are just hanging out on the street. But I always did it from a perspective of respect. And also it's about capturing our histories. Now in this period of book banning and and erasure, those earlier pictures are very important. Some of the gentrification is being done. People don't even know what the communities look like anymore.
Right.
Unless you had the pictures from that period. So that's what got me initially involved in doing it back in the darkroom. And the darkroom was kind of a hyperactive person, you can't tell, but the darkroom was a place it's kind of meditation. Sitting in the dark.
I can see that.
Yeah.
I can see that.
It was a very quiet place, and you focused, and it was kind of magical watching these pieces of paper develop into images in the chemicals.
Absolutely. There's another image, I believe, correct?
Yes. This one I call Band of Brothers. I was coming down Hamilton, heading away from where the family partnership is, and I saw 3 older men on the porch, one left, but what got my eye was that cast iron statue of a Marine.
Right in the corner there.
So I stopped to talk to them, and the man on the left is a Desert Storm vet, and the man on the right is Vietnam.
Wow.
So again, the lens I have is that these men, one man, they don't live there. The man who left lives there, but about 2 blocks up, there's a veterans housing complex. I think it's run by the county housing organization. But it just speaks to not forgetting our veterans and who they were, particularly veterans of color, because some people don't know, but the Vietnam so-called war was the first integrated military action. Before that, troops were segregated.
Right. The Vietnam War, it grips me in my heart, because it really, the ramifications and the trickle down from the effects of things that went on there really impacted one part of my family in a very negative way.
Mm.
Um, and so it amazes. I'm fascinated by the fact that how you can find the story, could just sort of like haphazardly come across the story in such depth in
Well,
in your photography.
yeah. Well, I mean, I do see storytelling as one aspect of my photography. My
Right.
imagery. And when I can, I do stop and try to talk to the people. I do straight up street photography where I don't ask every single person I take a picture of, but in
Hmm.
some cases, particularly in this one, I wanted to interact with them.
Right.
And as you said, you have a kind of a connection. My brief period of time incarcerated came about because, and I used to, when I worked for 15 years with the sheriff's office in Dutchess County, I used to tell the men on my unit that when I went to court, there were there was one extra person in the court, and that was a recruiter.
Hmm.
Because during the height of the Vietnam War, they mined the courts and gave a lot of people who were facing prison the option of going into combat. And I
Right.
initially said I would, but after I thought about it for a while, I said nobody was shooting at me at Rikers. So
Right. Exactly.
I said I'll take my bid. But
Yeah.
so that's another connection to that there.
Hmm.
And there's another gentleman I've been talking to out on the on Route 9 heading toward Wappingers, who panhandles money there, named Will. And I have a vision. I've been talking to him. I'm trying to get a hold of his Dress Blues. He's a combat veteran in the Marine Corps and was blown up, walks with a limp. But I want to get a picture of him with his Dress Blues with his sign
Mm.
saying he's homeless. Because something like 16 to 19 veterans are taking their own lives every day.
Right.
And that's much higher than it was Vietnam. In a decade after the Vietnam War, beside the 50,000 men and women who were killed in the Vietnam War, another almost 30,000 committed suicide in the next decade.
And it's another group that's invisible.
Yes.
It's not in the daily conversation.
Right.
Talking about your prison work, you worked as an academic coordinator for higher education in prison. Can you speak to that experience and how that work in this field translated into your artistic work at all?
Well, if I could just back up a second, um, I worked part time when I was living in Ulster County um, through a program that's based in the Family Partnership, and I was a part time transition counselor at the Dutchess County Jail. Gary Christensen, who eventually became the head of the jail, had a vision, and he actually hired myself. All three transition counselors at one time at that jail were all formerly incarcerated, which was unprecedented. And even there, I had a course I called cinema therapy, where I showed independent films to the men on our transition reentry unit. And I call it backdoor therapy because, particularly for men, it's very hard to get us to emote. But if I showed Boys in the Hood, or the Antoine Fisher story, where
Mhm.
by the end of that story, I could hear men sniffling in the background because it triggered things. Then we'd process the film, and that was a way to come forward. So that was a way of bringing the arts and film and cinema therapy, into a jail. Um, and the when I retired from the county, I had met Sean Pica, who's the executive director of Hudson Link. Also, and 85% of their staff, maybe 90%, are all formerly incarcerated. And I asked if I could work with them, and I was hired as an academic coordinator. And because of my work of for 10 years, Gold, I and a gentleman named Harris Bryman ran a men's group at Shawangunk, which is a supermax for the state of New York.
Hmm.
So to give you an example, why I call it a supermax, I was there for 10 years. Only one man left our group of 25 in 10 years, and he was transferred to the feds.
Mm.
So people do some serious
Right.
time there. So I asked, they were trying to set up a program. So I went back in and we partnered with Ulster Community College and set up a 2-degree program. I had one graduation before COVID shut everything down.
So, what would you consider to be one of your greatest accomplishment in social activism in the work that you've done so far?
Well, I used to work for something called the Virginia Community Development Organization that had something called the Assemblies. A guy named Don, I think it was Don Douglas, was an African American gentleman who ran the program,
Mm-hmm.
and the only requirement in Virginia to belong to the assembly was to be registered. And our and some other grassroots organizations' efforts led to the election of the first African American governor in that state. So I learned a lot doing that kind of work. And I also think that the work I did with Hudson Link is very powerful. I mean, Bard also has a program. Then Cornell, a number of colleges are in the prison system,
Mm-hmm.
but Hudson Link, the men who formed that, came out of there. It goes back to Attica. The each one
Mm-hmm.
teach one.
Right.
And when I first
Right.
started working with Poughkeepsie and bless their souls, but Tree and
Yes.
Latif, they were major forces in the city.
Right.
Both people who were some people call returning citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So that I consider, there's a term when I worked with the Harlem Children's Zone up in Harlem right after 9/11 with the West African population. They say, "I see you."
Yes.
I think one of the things about incarceration is that people don't understand when you come into a prison just to acknowledge and see these men and women, who've been erased.
Right.
They become
Absolutely.
detached from society. So seeing them, I learned a lot that, I mean, maybe 70% of the men that we registered for the college program in the 80s before crack and some of these other things hit, were in college.
Mm-hmm.
And they were 18 or 19, and then it hit the wall, crack epidemic, things happened, and they got pulled into the other vortexes.
And and speaking of Tree Arrington, I had the blessing of being mentored by him, working with
Mm.
him for over a decade, and that's when you said "I see you." That's the language that he
Mhm.
would use in the office, and
Mhm.
and the history of it, and where he would
Mhm.
explain to us where it came from.
Mhm.
So yeah,
And
beautiful.
seeing people beyond the labels they place on them, like you talk about the otherism,
Absolutely.
ex-offender, unhoused. I mean, they're terms that don't really explain how people got situated in the predicaments they're in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it was Ron Karanga. I had an old video. I'm showing my age now, but he was talking to a bunch of kids in an Afrocentric charter school, and he said, "Don't ever use the term slaves." He says, "Talk about enslaved," because it begs the question, who enslaved the people?
Right.
Now you have people like Ron DeSantis in Florida trying to erase that.
Oh, absolutely. Right.
And to say that we who were dragged here in chains, who built the White House, who built the Pentagon, who built Wall Street, learned it was some kind of a work training program. It
Right.
wasn't.
It's absolutely absurd. It's
Mhm.
crazy,
Well,
and we can go
Hakeem
into
Adabudi,
huh?
Hakeem Adabudi,
Okay.
the poet, he once said anybody can build a nation with 20 million slaves.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's I'm in Florida now, actually.
God bless you.
I know.
Watch your back.
And I'm in Florida out loud down here. They see me coming. Let's talk about the work that you're about to do coming up in Woodstock with Dan Goldman. Can you talk to us a little about Dan Goldman and at WHAM, Woodstock Artists Association and Museum, in the fall of 2023? And I thank you for inviting me to be a part of that.
Yes. Well, Dan Goldman, who I actually met at WHAM, we're both photographers. He's an acclaimed, photographer. He's got a lot more experience than I do in many ways. But we met at WHAM and began to talk, and we had a lot of things in common. And then WHAM does different submissions, calls. And for the first time, they're over a 100-year-old organization. And for the first time in their history, they put out a call for people to submit proposals for a artist-driven curation, to curate an actual art program in the front area, the whole front of WHAM.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan and I said, let's take a shot at it, and I think there were maybe 8 or 9 applications. The juror who selected them is an African-American and woman of color who got her MFA at Sotheby's, so she's got some depth, and our approach, I think, was, I wouldn't say unique, but I wanted it to be controversial. We didn't get it, that was okay.
Mm-hmm.
But it was about intersectionality. It was about creating a safe space for artists to step out. We use the term behind the veil which is a term Dan heard Cornel West use in a speech talking about Dubois and the concept of double consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So we came together with our heads, and I have a lot of not a lot of knowledge, but about this emerging concept of intersectionality. So we wrote the proposal to create a space for artists to come together to be fully present in as many identities as they wanted to be. For example, the last artist I spoke just before we came on the program has a website. She is phenomenal in landscape artist. She's an Asian Cantonese artist. But when Trump got elected, she started doing other kinds of work. That work isn't on her website, but she did submit it for the BIPOC show that Nikki Hung and a number of other people, Sandy Morales, Shirley, my wife, we juried it. And, people talk about, well, we can't find any artists of color. We had 32 submissions from women from Maine, Pennsylvania. Matter of fact, Christina drove all the way in here with her work.
Wow.
She's from Hershey, Pennsylvania. So the Wham show is going to have, I think we're capping it at 10 artists.
Okay.
Amazing group, including yourself. And we want to involve spoken word, sculpture, photography, and a lot of different aspects of it. But the theme is, coming out from behind the veil. Mm-hmm. And there's a significant number of artists of color in it, but there are also a number of artists of European American descent. And for them, we had some really interesting discourse around the proposals, concept of behind the veil. And then Dan and I, one night we were having a debate about it, realized that, this is intersectionality. The role
mm-hmm.
of people is to use their asset, use
right.
their forms of privilege to support other disempowered groups of people.
Absolutely.
So someone like Dan Goldman, a white American photographer, but he's a little different. His thing is pulling back the veil that most Americans don't want to look behind.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And say, look, so he's uncovering, he's unveiling, he's
right.
an unveilist.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And sometimes there's a not sometimes, most times, there's a discomfort with that.
Yes.
Yes. People will translate into that being confrontational, where it's not. And the confrontationalism is actually the confrontation that they're having within themselves. It's not external.
No, definitely.
It's
I won't name. I'm working in an organization, and when I kind of push them a little bit on their issues around inclusion, they say, "Well, our membership is very uncomfortable," and I said, "Good,
absolutely,
good." But I also use myself. I said I've done a lot of work on myself,
mm-hmm.
as a man, in the men's movement and stuff like that. I said, but I'm doing a lot of work on my being open and fully trying to understand the trans community.
Right.
That's new to me,
mm-hmm.
and I'm uncomfortable about how I feel about it. I get nervous about pronouns and everything else, but I put it out there.
Right.
I mean, staying in my comfort zone doesn't work.
Right.
There will be no change.
Right. And it doesn't, from my humble opinion, doesn't create a beautiful world.
Not at all.
It creates, sometimes when we feel anxious, part of that is what we've created sometimes within ourselves of not wanting to have the conversation.
Well, a lot of people are really struggling with the issue of homelessness and the unhoused in the city of Poughkeepsie right now,
mm-hmm.
and it's a real issue. But I'm very concerned that the homeless wind up becoming the targets. And after a recent meeting I was driving home, and I thought to myself, the people who now are injustifiably concerned about their businesses and
mm-hmm.
trying to do a business with the population in front of their stores and stuff like that. But maybe if more of us 20 years ago voted for more of a wage, minimum wage should be around $22 to $25 an hour, which it is in some other countries, for people to have a sustainable life.
Right.
Maybe we should have paid more attention to voting for housing, integrated housing for people.
Mm-hmm.
We should have spoke out in the 90s when they deinstitutionalized the mental institutions and said the money would follow the patients, and it never did. And that was the birthplace of some of what we're dealing with now.
And part of it,
go ahead. Sorry.
No. I would say part of that, I think, is tied into the otherism. Like, it's not going to happen to me It's the
Mm.
other person until it happens to you. My family used to pick on me because I always wanted to know what my neighbor was doing, because I always felt that if my neighbor's in trouble, eventually it's going to show up on our doorstep. So I want to know who my neighbor is. When my
Right.
neighbor's in need, I want to be able to say, well, here's some grocery, or what is it that you
Mm.
need? Because part of the expression, the stuff runs downhill all the time, and
Well,
I look at this with the heroin
mm,
in the community. Our communities have plagued with heroin for many years. And I really had an issue when it was being perceived like it was a pandemic, a disease, because when my people were going through it, there was just
mm,
those people. And I had to work through that, honestly,
mm,
over
yeah.
the last 10, 15 years. I had to like let go of that anger, resentment, and say, okay, let's get to work, because no matter what color the person is, no matter what economic level they are, they're still hurting.
Mm,
They're still hurting. But the heroin went through our community, and no one really gave a damn.
right.
To be honest with you. But there's a question. How did you get started in the arts, and how have the arts impacted your growth as an individual?
Well, as I said, I've been doing photography a long time. I put the camera down for a while, but I really enjoyed photography. But it's only recently, and I have to give credit to my wife Shirley, that I'm beginning to grow into the identity of an artist.
Hmm.
You
Interesting.
know, to me, art galleries were a play toy of the privileged.
Hmm.
You know, and I never thought of myself as an artist. You know, so I'm beginning to accept that more, the identity of that, and also enjoying just the creative aspect of it.
Hmm.
You know, I'd be lying to say I'm thinking, well, how can I sell this piece of art? You know, my wife keeps saying, don't worry about selling it. You're gonna spoil your creativity by getting caught up in that,
Right. Right.
and she's right about that. You know, so that's how I began a long time ago. I got back into it after I retired.
Mhm.
Also, I wanted to capture what's going on. Again, I think that um, one of my lines used to be, still is, I guess, you know, in many countries where there's rebellion against the state, against the oppressor, some of the first people they imprison are the artists, the poets. You know,
Yeah.
some of the first people they snatch up and put away.
They come for us.
They come
'Cause
for us.
we're the voice of the people. Oh, that may be a poem. They come for us. Huh?
There you
There's
go. There
something
you
in the
go.
way
There
that
you go.
sounded. They come for
Okay.
us. I'm gonna digress just a little bit, because
Mm,
someone did ask a question in relationship to being a writer. They have a short volume of poetry, I believe, a couple of poetry books, and wanted to know how to get exposure. Well, Art Mid-Hudson is a wonderful outreach organization. You can get in contact with them, or you can find me throughout social media, especially with spoken word and poetry. I curate events, and so I'd be more than willing to hear your work, and just shoot me an email. But I did want to address that because it is a question that came through. Before we begin to wrap up, I have another question for you. If you had to give a younger activist, artist, and social workers advice, what would you say?
read
Hmm.
and read the old books. You know, learn the history. You know, to me, oppression is one playbook that gets used over and over again. You know, so that would be my thing, because there are a lot of people out here tr- trying to doing some good work, but you know, people, at least from my generation, are concerned that they haven't done the research.
Hmm.
You know, we need to understand Tulsa, Oklahoma. You need to know that what's going on now has been going on from day one.
Right.
You know, it looks different, the technology's different. People laugh about the movie Reefer Madness, but you know, the mythology was that a regular bullet can't drop somebody on weed. Police up their armament. You know, now we're
Hmm.
up to AR-15s and tanks and yeah,
Right.
police states.
Yeah, and trying to
Mm,
erase our history. I'm not even
right,
trying, erasing
right,
the history for that very reason, so that when
right,
you go to research it, it's not
mm,
there.
right. And I'd
You
also say talk to people in the other sectors.
Mm-hmm.
Don't just stay in your silo. Work with the gay community. Talk to the Latinx community. Talk to the working class, talk to the union organizers, talk to the unhoused people, because that's the point of intersectionality, is it's all common, and a blessing, I think, and it is a little complex, the model, but the previous model was very hierarchical, and it had a lot of different groups of oppressed people running up against each other rather than looking for common zones where we can work together.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
The Poor People's March.
Yeah, and that's another thing about reading. MLK was a very radical individual.
Yes.
If you can still find it on YouTube, his speech about why I opposed the war in Vietnam at Riverside Church. When he said that in the opening, you can hear a pin drop for the rest of that speech.
Absolutely.
And I don't think it's any fluke that his life was taken not too long after that.
Right.
He crossed into the area supporting unions, so going against the war. And that's when I think the decision was made to take him out.
So, Onaje, it's been really great. I want to let people know what's coming up. In addition to WHAM, right there in Poughkeepsie at the Pavilion in Warris Park, we're having a spoken word poetry reading on August 4th. When I get back in town, I'm going to run to that microphone, and we have some dynamic individuals that will be sharing poetry with you. It's going to feature Stephanie Russell, who is the current poet laureate for Dutchess County, and also an artist by the name of Sammy B. Let me use the correct way. Sammy B is going to be there. And Sammy has an absolutely incredible story of recovery. And so it's just great to have both of these ladies sharing their work on that day. So coming out from 5 to 9 p.m. It's free. Bring your food. Bring your drinks with you. Let's sit down, have a good time, and have community. Onaje, thank you. Our next show on August 31st, we'll actually be speaking with Stephanie Russell, the newly appointed Dutchess County Poet Laureate. So mark your calendar for next month. Thank you to the team at Arts Mid-Hudson, Emma, Christian, Melissa, and I thank you for tuning in to Leading with Artivism. Good night, everyone, and I'll see you next month.
Good night.